Welcome to Rhythms of Faith. Thanks for joining us today. We're thrilled to be here with Dana Gioia. Dana, thanks for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a working class Catholic kid from LA. My dad was Sicilian, my mom was Mexican. I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and then I went up to Stanford in Northern California and entered the 20th century. So it's been a very strange life for me because my background and my career are fundamentally in two different worlds. I'm a poet. I have an extremely odd life for a poet. It began more or less normally, which is I went to college, I went to graduate school in literature. I thought I would be a professor of literature. But at Harvard as a graduate student, I realized that how I was being taught to read literature, to talk about it, to write about it, was not only somewhat alien to my own experience of literature, I was being taught to write about it and talk about it in ways that the people I came from couldn't even understand. And it just didn't feel right to me, so I left. My parents, wonderful people, in fact, today's would have been my dad's 107th birthday, were wonderful people, but they neglected to give me the private income I so richly deserved. And so I had the indignity, I hope none of the listeners have had this, of having to work for a living. So I decided just to get a job in business. I went to Stanford Business School, and then I spent the next 15 years in corporate life. Now, the odd thing about that seemingly ordinary turn of career was that I went to business school to be a poet. I constructed my life in business so that every night and every weekend I could write. And after 15 years, I was actually a very well-known writer, and so having worked my way up the corporate ladder, I just walked out the door one day and became a bum. A career option which I recommend to everyone, especially if you have a private income. And so for the next 12, 13 years, I was a full-time writer. I wrote poems, I wrote songs, I reviewed, I became a cultural commentator for the BBC, and my business career had been in New York, but I missed my parents, I missed my background, so I moved back to California so that my children would know their grandparents, that they would know where they came from, that they were from the working class, that they were Latins, and that they were Catholic. And so I moved back there, and I was very happy, and then God decided to punish me for my many sins, which we don't have time to talk about today because they're so numerous. And so he made me become the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. And so although I turned down the job twice, I eventually ended up in Washington, D.C., working under George W. Bush to rebuild a failed federal agency, the NEA. And I ended up spending 10 years in Washington. I was able to revitalize the agency, build the budget every year, and launch the largest programs in the agency's history. You may know some of them, Poetry Out Loud, which is the National High School Poetry Recitation Contest, Shakespeare in American Communities, which is the largest tour of Shakespeare in history, in which high school teachers can bring their classes to see professional productions of Shakespeare of these companies that tour from town to town. Operation Homecoming, which was the first time the NEA had ever worked with the military, which allowed the troops and their families to write about their wartime experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and many other programs. I then came back to California. Once again, I had to walk away from a lot of very lucrative job offers, and I decided that the job I really wanted paid nothing, had no benefits, no retirement, didn't even have a dental plan, and that was the job of rebuilding Catholic literary life in the United States. I felt that Catholics had lost their voice in literary culture. They'd lost their voice in high culture in general, and that we needed to become a more vital and vibrant part of the conversation which constitutes American literary culture. And this took many forms. I've been working with a lot of small presses, especially Wise Blood Books, wonderful small Catholic literary press. But the primary venture that I did was to create a national Catholic literary conference at the University of Southern California, where I was teaching part-time at that point. I didn't ask for anybody's permission. I didn't ask for any money. A priest and I began to work on it, Father James Heft, a Marianist. Some of you may know him. And he said, well, we have no money. He says, my Catholic Center has no money. What are you going to do? And I told him the truth. I'm going to do what needs to be done and trust in divine providence. We had a fantastic conference. Well-known writers from all over the country came, and we didn't even have a deficit. 2 years later, Angela O'Donnell did a second conference at Fordham. Then Michael Murphy did one even larger, 1,000 people nearly, at Loyola Chicago. Then Jessica Hooten Wilson did one at the University of Dallas. And this weekend, we are doing the 5th conference, the largest one ever. Over 1,200 people have enrolled at Notre Dame. So what have I done? I've spent my life scribbling, talking, and generally wasting other people's time.
It's great to be part of your wasting of other people's time. I consider it a great privilege.
Well, I love Notre Dame. I don't get here very often, and I'm so pleased to be in your company having this conversation.
Would you be willing to read for us? We've asked you to read this poem, Prayer, because we'd really love to hear you talk about the imagery in this prayer and kind of where it comes from and where it's going.
This poem, which I never thought would be popular, is actually now one of my most famous poems, even though it's an extremely, I find, difficult poem. It's one of the selections they have for me in the Norton Book of Poetry. And more to the point, and I know JJ knows this, the composer Morten Lauridsen has set this as a choral piece, which is really widely performed all over the United States, and there's a solo version and a duet version. I will say two things about it. My wife and I lost our first son. He died of sudden infant death syndrome at 4 months. He was a beautiful, healthy boy, was never sick a day in his life. And then one morning, right before Christmas actually, we woke to discover he was dead. I don't need to tell people what this experience represents for a young couple. He was our first, at that point, and only child. We've had 2 more boys who I don't think were anywhere nearly as good as he is. In fact, sometimes, but anyway, but I love him dearly. And so in the background of this poem is a prayer for my lost son. The second thing I'll say for it is, don't try to make sense of it. Just listen to it. I talk about the subject sideways. I simply list a series of images and then lead to the conclusion. Prayer. Echo of the clock tower, footstep in the alleyway, sweep of the wind sifting the leaves, jeweler of the spider web, connoisseur of autumn's opulence, blade of lightning harvesting the sky, keeper of the small gate, choreographer of entrances and exits, midnight whisper traveling the wires, seducer, healer, deity, or thief. I will see you soon enough, in the shadow of the rainfall, in the brief violet darkening a sunset. But until then, I pray, watch over him, as a mountain guards its covert oar, and the harsh falcon its flightless young.
I'm so struck by this poem. The first thing is maybe more technical, but the way that you use the S sound rhythmically, just absolutely, it kind of bobs and weaves through the rhythm. There's nothing really to say about that except to say like the rhythmic nature of how you use the S's has this evocative feeling of lament and perhaps anger at God, if I can say that, and the reason I wanted to bring that up is because in our class, Rhythms of Faith, we use the book of Psalms as our kind of primary source book. And one of the things that we're constantly stressing with our students is that, God accepts all of our responses to him.
Yeah.
And in fact, these responses are so much more about the way that they form ourselves than what they may or may not mean to God. But is there anything that resonates there with you that you could talk about?
Well, I think both of the things you said are very true. The sound of a poem is the poem. People don't understand this. In fact, a lot of poets, I think, don't understand that. People say, well, what does the poem mean? And a poem doesn't mean something intellectual. Mm-hmm. What a poem does, a poem is a different kind of language. It is a language which expresses and requires to hear your full humanity. So in a poem, I address your mind, I address your emotions, I address your physical body, I address your memory and your intuition. And I ask you to bring your whole humanity into the poem and not divide it into little pieces, which is how we get through the daily world. And so the physicality of poetic language is necessary, or I'm not talking to your body. I'm not talking to your memories. And I have an odd theory of poetry that I developed about halfway through my literary career, but it was one of the decisive things that I recognized, is that what I'm doing in a poem is I'm creating a room for you to come into. The room has windows that look out to the world. In fact, the room may have more than one entrance, but I bring you into it, and you recognize immediately what kind of a room it is. It's a room of sorrow, it's a room of reflection, it's a room of anger, a room of love. And I have it half furnished, but I've left some of the necessary furniture out. And you, the listener, have to bring that from your memory, from your intuition, from your imagination. And your act of completing the poem is your experience of the poem. And I think what happens is a lot of poets give you a room in which there's nothing left for you to put in.
Yeah.
And so you can never make it your own. So this is an extreme example of that because it's a very mysterious poem. You have to figure out what all of these things do. But I'm trying to put your mind and your imagination in a place where you can, in a sense, deal, or you can experience, you can feel the emotion of the poem. Your second comment, I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure how to talk to God. I think you talk to God with your whole life, at every moment of your life. Sometimes you speak to him well, sometimes you just mumble. Luckily or unluckily, he knows everything that you think and you intend and you haven't done. And so years ago, I don't know if you know the novelist Anthony Burgess. He wrote A Clockwork Orange is his most famous book, but a wonderful novelist, wonderful critic. And I had to interview him once. And I met him at the St. Regis Hotel for breakfast, and he clearly wanted to blow me off. But he liked me, so we ended up going to breakfast, staying through lunch, having lunch, finally at afternoon drinks. We were there about 6 hours, and then finally his wife came and yelled at me and yanked him away. But it was a fantastic day with this fellow. And he thought I was just a journalist, and he knew that I had a job in business. He couldn't figure out why he was talking to a businessman who was interviewing him, who had read all his books. And I told him I was a poet. And then he stopped, And he gave me really good advice. He says, when you're a poet, remember you write for God. And I've been thinking about that remark ever since. And I don't think he meant, well, you're supposed to write religious poems and you're supposed to be pious. It's that God is the only person who knows everything about you, and you really can't fool God. And poets have a tremendous desire to fool people, So, as a poet,
Everyone does.
I'm saying, I want you to think that I'm a much more emotional and deep and caring and wonderful person. You're putting on all these poses as a poet, and God understands when you're posing, when you're lying. And sometimes poets make big lies in their poems. I hear that a lot, but usually they make lots of little white lies. And so I've always kept in mind that unfortunately, God is one of my readers, and he doesn't want me to lie. And God wants me to understand what is true, and more difficult, he wants me to understand that everything true, seen from the right perspective, is beautiful. And so I think of myself as trying to find the beauty in existence, especially in really difficult moments. I'm lucky. I've got the second best reader to God as my wife, and anything that isn't true, she just calls my bluff on it. So so it's nice to be living and loving your toughest critic.
This is another connection to the Psalms, not to belabor, but I was really struck by that as I was listening to you read this too. In the Psalms, when I teach the Psalms to students, they're often baffled because the Psalms are very difficult to understand. They use a lot of imagery that we don't expect. They have strange transitions between different emotional states, and sometimes you're not sure who's talking and who they're talking to. And they want to enter into these as if they were prose. And that's very difficult. But they also are afraid to enter into lament, grief, anger, because they are afraid that those states of being will draw them away from God. And one of the things and away from beauty and away from recognizing who God is to them, one of the things I find really beautiful about this, and it does also remind me of what I love about the Psalms, is the way that the darkness of this experience actually reveals beauties about who God is, even kind of that one line where it could be a bit of a challenge, I will see you soon enough. There's something almost hostile about that, and yet not. There's that it's also just very real. And I think a lot of my students, when they are reading the Psalms, they're afraid of that kind of emotional response, which also then makes it hard to grieve and respond to all the things that are really wrong in the world that we're in, whether those things are personal or whether they're more social or even larger than that.
Well, it breaks my heart that young Catholics, especially at Notre Dame, which is the greatest Catholic American university, don't know Scripture better. They don't know the parables, they don't know the Psalms, they don't know the prophetic, any of the prophetic books. And so I think that one laments this, but the real response is, okay, let's sit down and learn them now. I was teaching a very famous poem by Yeats, his most famous poem, I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. And I spent an entire class at USC. I had 200 students. And USC, by the way, has more Catholics than Notre Dame. I don't think we do a better job with them, but I've taught there for 9 years. But I had this, and so we're going through it. And we spent I look at every element, diction, the images, the historical background. And finally, we've just found everything there is to know about this poem. And I said, well, I've left one thing out. There is an allusion in the poem. Does anybody see what the allusion is? 200 students, complete silence. And I said, well, I'll give you a hint. It's an allusion from Scripture. Silence. I said, well, I'll give you another hint. It's the only line in the poem that happens twice, or the only phrase, which is, I will arise and go now. And I said, does anybody know? No. I said, well, it's from the New Testament. Silence. I said, it's from one of the parables. Silence. Now, the majority of kids in this class earlier have identified themselves as Christians. A lot of them are Catholics. A lot of them are active believers. And I said, well, it's from a parable. Nothing. I said, it's from the parable of the prodigal son. Who knows the parable of the prodigal son? So I have like 3 or 4 students. Huh. And so what I really wanted to do was to, give them all a kick in the butt. But I did what I should do. I said, well, then let me read you the parable. And then there was a father who had 2 sons, and I read them the entire parable. And I said, who says the line that's in the poem? They said, well, the prodigal son says it. And when does he say it? It's when he's starving in the pig pen. And why does he say it? It's because he's unhappy in his life, and he wants to go back home where he is loved. And so I said, what is Yeats saying when he says, I will arise and go now? And I said, every reader, I think a poem was published in something like 1899 or something, every reader in the English language would have recognized that line then, and they would have had the associations of that. So, and I said, and now you have it. Now you share this with Yeats. But we do have a lot of remedial work. And the Psalms are challenging because they're not narrative like a parable is. And there's so many of them, and they're so various. But if you believe in Christ, if you believe in revelation, you have an odd thing you have to deal with. God, whom you think of as a fairly practical being, has made the editorial decision, the baffling editorial decision, of putting 1/3 of Revelation in poetry. And I think most American Catholics feel this was an editorial mistake on the part of the deity. But let's give God the benefit of our judgment and say, well, what reason did he have? And it's, I think, a pretty obvious one. There's some things about the mysteries of our faith, about the glories of our faith, about the sorrows of our faith, about the challenge of our faith that don't fit into plain prose. And those can be best expressed in poetry. So you see poetry in the Psalms, which encompass all of the moods of human existence. You see it in the prophetic books. You finally see it in in Revelations. Jesus and St. Paul are often quoting poetry. The Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount are a poem. And so, in order to understand the revelation that God has given us, we have to gird up our loins like a man or a mature woman, and deal with verse. And I think that's a challenge, but you're doing the right way. I mean, you have them read it, you have them recite it, you have them set it to music, because these are the poems that God has given us to articulate all of the moods of humanity, including some violent ones in the psalm. There's some psalms that make you, they're going to dash your enemy's children against the stones. Well, that's not very nice.
For those playing along at home.
Yeah.
But you understand that these are all things that are acted out in the course of human life.
Yeah. So you've written, this is a great transition into this question about silence and stillness and the way you've written about it in your poetry. You have a poem called Marriage of Many Years.
Yes.
And one of the lines in that is, most of what happens beyond words, which I love that a poet has written that. that line, of course.
Yeah.
How does this resonate with your understanding of contemplation or prayer? And what does contemplation prayer have to do with your creative process of writing poems?
Well, I don't want to say that poems are prayers, because there's a lot of poems that are just silly or self-absorbed or anything else. But the special attention to language and to meaning that is in a poem is, I think, similar to what a prayer should be. And our greatest prayers are poems. I mean, it's interesting, the moment that Christ's incarnation is announced to the world, not as a supernatural mystery where Gabriel's talking to Mary, but is in the visitation. And how does Mary, tell Elizabeth that she is pregnant with the Savior of the world? She does so in a poem. It's a poem that we call the Magnificat. My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in the Lord my Savior. And it goes on to this wonderful poem, that announces that this is a moment that will change history. And why does Mary speak a poem? Why does St. Luke give her a poem? Why did, at least according to traditional art, the angel dictating the gospel to St. Luke give him a poem? Because mere prose would not do to express the joy, the wonder, and the mystery of Mary's message. And I had to leave Harvard. I had to leave formal literary life. I had to go into a wilderness of my own making, which included about a 9-10 hour business day during the day, so I could then have a few hours of silence at night where I could write. For 7 years after leaving graduate school, I did not submit a poem to anyone, but I wrote, I rewrote, and I tried, in a sense, to create a space in which I could hear the sound of my own voice as someone else might hear it, to craft, find a way of crafting language. And I wanted to write poems, and I don't know if I've succeeded. I mean, that's up for other people to say, that a literary person could hear, a fellow poet could hear, but also an ordinary, alert, intelligent person who didn't think they liked poetry could hear. And, to create a style that was, I'm not saying that the dumbest person in the world is going to, jump, in applause with my poems, but I wanted to write a kind of poem that invited people of various experiences to come in, and perhaps each of them would hear it differently. And because, how do I put this? If I write a poem, I don't want to tell you what to do with it. I want you to say, this is either useful in my life, or it isn't. That I want a poem that in a sense, it becomes a kind of a gift to you that it's not a gift you want to return to the store the next day.
Yeah. I want to go back to the Magnificat for a minute. Of course, that's very dear to my heart.
Yeah.
And it's also the heart of our evening prayer liturgy. That's one of the other things we've had our students do, is learn to pray morning and evening prayer as part of the Liturgy of the Hours. And it's very difficult for them. Maybe in the same, of course, some of it is because the psalmody, so it brings all that difficulty of the Psalms in. And then also the richness, but also it's not a super accessible experience, some of our liturgies. So how would you advise people who are experiencing some of these?
The answer is so easy.
Yeah?
It's so simple, but you won't like it.
I mean, I probably will, but
They need to
might not
memorize
like
it.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Catholics should have most of their prayers memorized, and they should memorize the great language, because by memorizing it, not only do you master it, but what's the metaphor that we use for memory? To know it by heart.
Yeah.
Yep.
You bring it into the center of your being, and so, and you should pray it. I mean, I pray for the living, but I pray for the dead. I've been rereading Dante's Purgatorio, and what do all the souls want Dante to tell people? They want them to go back to their relatives and say, "Pray for me."
Yep.
And so, and I pray in Latin mostly, and I pray in English, and saying the prayer is a blessing to me.
Yeah.
But I think you need to give them a psalm to memorize.
Yeah.
And they should and not only that, you should make them stand up together at the beginning. And you won't do this.
You just did it
They won't do
yesterday.
this. Make them stand up at the beginning of the class and recite it chorally.
Yeah.
And you do it class after class after class. And that way, even if you're terrible teachers,
Yeah. They get
you've,
something out of
you've
it.
given them a gift
That's right.
that they will bless you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. The Liturgy of the Hours developed as a way to memorize the psalmody because you didn't have, not everybody had a book of the Psalms. They definitely didn't have a Bible in their little cells in the monastic place. So you would go to liturgy every day, and you would slowly memorize the entire Psalter
Yeah.
and all of the canticles because you had heard it so many times.
Well, you have the Liturgy of the Hours is a wonderful thing, but just think of life in general. There are times when you're driving along, you're walking along, you're stuck in a line, you're on a phone, and you need to say a prayer.
Yeah.
The other day, 2 days ago, a dear friend of mine called me with terrible, terrible news about her health. It shocked me. It was not the person was too young to have that sort of a diagnosis. And as soon as I got off the phone, I began to pray. And I didn't have a book. I didn't have the study, but you need to have those. You need to have poems and prayers, at hand's reach at all times. You need to be able to have those words that are necessary.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of times. I wrote a very famous article. It's called "Can Poetry Matter?" I mean, it came out in 1991. It's still probably the most famous essay on American poetry for the last 30 years, and it generated more mail than any article ever published in the Atlantic Monthly. Very controversial article. I got hundreds of letters from people that hated it, all of whom were in creative writing departments. I mean, it was weird. Every negative letter was from somebody affiliated with the creative writing department, but 90% of the mail was favorable. And I got letters from all kinds of people: ranchers, politicians, soldiers. But my favorite letter was a woman who was a working class woman. I think she lived in Wyoming. And she said, that she was very poor, but she always loved poetry. And she had 3 sons, and she had sent them all off to college. And it broke her heart that none of them came back from today's colleges loving poetry. And this is the line I remember. She goes, she says, "I know a lot of poems by heart. And some days, standing at the sink, I say a poem to myself, and it's the only way I get through the day." And that's why we need poetry. That's why we need prayer.
Yeah.
We don't need the Psalms to study in class, although we damn well better study them. But we need them because they're there to get us through life. As we stand at this dirty sink of our life, having to do the dishes with no energy, we need something that gladdens our heart, that quickens our heartbeat.
Dana, I wonder if we could finish. How do you write a poem?
Seldom and with great difficulty. Poetry, in my experience, is mostly involuntary. every now and then, when I'm writing for music, I'll write something, but I've got to wait. And then when it comes, I've got to grab it when it comes. And it comes usually, I get a couple of lines, maybe I get a stanza, and then I just see where that takes me. And a lot of times I take a poem into 20, 30, 40, 50, even 100 drafts as I start to develop it. And I want the poem, if I know I'm given the beginning of a poem, I'm usually given the first line. If I know exactly where that goes, it's not a very interesting poem.
Given as in inspired with it, or someone?
A poem is never comes as an idea. I mean, there's a poem called Interrogations at Noon. It's titled, I had to write a poem for the BBC about noon because they were doing a poem every hour, and I wanted midnight. They said, no, we're not broadcasting at midnight. And I said, I want dawn. He says, no, Seamus Heaney took dawn. So I said, what about noon? So they gave me noon. And so I was just thinking, what about it? And then suddenly, the poem came to me, or the beginning of the poem came to me. And I had no idea where it was going, except a character emerged. And it goes, I won't read the whole poem, but it goes, just before noon, I often hear a voice, cool and insistent, whispering in my head. It is the better man I might have been, who chronicles the life I've never led. And so suddenly I had that, then I had to figure out, okay, there is a voice in my head. It is like a doppelganger who is telling me, what a mess I'm making of things. And so then the poem did this, and it ended up taking me to a place that I didn't really expect. But and I just let the poem happen, and I write and rewrite, and I let the language tell me what to do. Because what I'm really doing is my conscious mind is the mediator between the language, which is outside of me, and the intuition, which is inside of me, my unconscious mind. And that's balancing the two things, because whenever you write a poem, you are in a partnership with the language, and you don't have controlling interest. The language is so much greater than you are. You're a minority partner. And so you've got to let the language tell you what the key decisions are to make.
Beautiful.
I love that business metaphor there, too. It's great.
The business of life.
Well, our last question is a tradition on the podcast to ask you what's an animal you identify with and why.
Well, I love cats because they're beautiful, difficult creatures, and I like the way that a cat suddenly comes to you and then just walks off, and it always seems to be lost in his or her own thoughts.
So you love partnerships in which you don't have a controlling interest, is what I'm hearing.
I accept reality. I live out in the country, and I have more contact with animals than I do human beings, and I find it very rewarding relationships. I have a pet deer named Betty, and when I call her, she emerges from the woods, and I give her, what's left over from breakfast, and then eventually her various kids and relations show up, and they're a motley bunch. But I enjoy the relationship I have with her. And she gets rather impatient with me if I'm not giving her something that she really wants. Usually her kids will eat it. Yeah. But I like that. But I like I like all relationships to be full of beauty, mystery, and surprise.
It's lovely. Thank you so much for joining us, Dana. This was a really lovely conversation.
Well, thank you for putting up with me.
Well, it's our honor to have you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for joining us on another Rhythms of Faith podcast.